She slept with a 9mm under her pillow and a scarred Belgian Malinois pressed against her spine. And for 3 years, that was the only configuration of safety Captain Lindsay Marchetti trusted. The wind off Georgian Bay hit different than anything in Kandahar, wetter, colder, angrier somehow, and it tore through the cedar siding of the cabin she'd built with her own hands outside Parry Sound, Ontario. To most people, that wind was a nuisance. To Lindsay, it was a perimeter alarm she didn't have to pay for. The worse the storm, the fewer strangers on her road, and fewer strangers was the only metric of a good day she had left. For 3 years she'd lived like this. No landline, no real internet, just a satellite hotspot she used twice a month to transfer her disability pension. Motion sensors zip-tied to the birches along the gravel drive. A police scanner she kept on low volume out of habit more than need. She'd done 2 tours with the Canadian Armed Forces in Kandahar province, and a third attached to a joint task force she still wasn't legally allowed to name out loud, and she had come home with most of her body intact and almost none of her mind in the condition she'd left it. The titanium plate in her hip ached when the barometric pressure dropped. That was the easy part. The part nobody warned her about was the part where every slammed door sounded like incoming, where she couldn't sit in a restaurant without her back to the wall, where a crowded grocery store could put her on the floor of aisle 6 with her hands over her head before she even registered deciding to move. She trusted exactly one living creature on this earth, and he was lying across her feet right now, 80 pounds of grey and black muscle with a torn left ear and a muzzle going silver early. His name was Diesel. He'd been a military working dog, explosives detection and patrol, attached to a unit that wasn't hers. Not originally. He'd come to her after his handler didn't come home, passed along the way surplus equipment gets passed along, except Diesel was not equipment, and everyone who'd ever met him knew it. He had a tattoo inked into the pale skin of his right ear, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to Lindsay except that they were the last official record of who he used to belong to before he belonged to her. They had saved each other more times than either of them could count, first in the dust outside Kandahar, and now in the silence of the Ontario bush. When Lindsay's nightmares dragged her under, thrashing and swearing at men who weren't there, it was the dead weight of Diesel's body across her chest that pulled her back. When she paced the cabin floor at 3 in the morning, convinced the tree line had moved, Diesel would plant himself by the door, ears up, utterly calm, and that calm was the only thing that could talk her down. Isolation, though, does nothing for biology. It started with a fever on a Thursday that she blamed on the flu going around at the Legion Hall, the one time a month she let herself be around other humans. By Friday, her right knee, the one that had taken shrapnel outside a market in 2019 and never been fully cleared of fragment, was swollen tight against her jeans. By Saturday night, there was a red line crawling up her thigh that she didn't need a medical degree to recognize as very, very bad. She sat in her armchair with the wood stove ticking and looked at her own leg like it belonged to someone else. Hot, glossy, throbbing in time with her pulse. "Of course," she muttered, the first words she'd said out loud in 4 days, and Diesel lifted his head off the floor and let out a low whine she'd learned to take seriously. He came over, pressed his nose to the inside of her wrist, then her throat, then held it there a beat too long. He'd been trained to detect explosive compounds, not human infection, but 3 years of sleeping, wrapped around a body that ran cold half the night, had taught him every degree of her temperature, better than any thermometer. "I'm fine," she told him, which was a lie they'd both gotten used to. By 2 in the morning, she wasn't fine. The fever had her hallucinating heat shimmer off the snowbanks outside her window, and underneath the delirium, one clear, terrified thought kept surfacing. If she died in this cabin, Diesel would not leave her body. He'd guard her until he starved, or until the OPP did a wellness check after someone noticed her truck hadn't moved, and a dog like Diesel, defending a corpse from strangers in uniform, was a dog who got put down in the snow. She had survived 2 war zones to die in a way that got her own dog killed, and something about that possibility cut through the fever clearer than anything else could have. She dragged herself out of the chair like her body had turned to wet sand, got Diesel's old patrol harness, buckled with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and said the only thing that mattered. "We're going to town, buddy." The drive to Parry Sound General should have taken 40 minutes. It took closer to 90 because somewhere around the second sweeping curve, past the Marina Road, her vision started tunneling, and the only thing keeping her truck on the right side of the center line was Diesel, sitting bolt upright in the passenger seat, barking sharp and short every time her eyes slid shut. By the time the hospital's red emergency sign swam up out of the dark, she was barely steering. She put the truck in park crooked across 2 spots, wrapped Diesel's leash twice around her wrist out of pure reflex, stay close, trust no one, and half fell out of the cab. Her knee gave out before she made it to the doors. Diesel braced under her, took her weight like he'd done it 100 times before, because he had, and together they limped through the sliding glass into the fluorescent shock of the ER. The waiting room hit her like a flashbang. Crying infant. Some teenager doubled over clutching his side. A radio scanner crackling at the triage desk. 3 years of nothing but wind and birdsong had not prepared her for it, and it showed. She swayed, grabbed a support post, and the room actually went quiet for a second, because it wasn't the soaked, grey-faced woman against the pillar that stopped people cold. It was the dog beside her, ears flat, hackles up, reading every fast movement in the room as a threat to be neutralized. "Ma'am," the triage nurse called out from behind the glass, voice tight. "You can't bring a dog in unless it's a registered service animal." Lindsay didn't hear the rest of it. The infection was a roar in her ears. The floor was tilting, and then it wasn't tilting anymore. It was rising up to meet her, and she went down hard on the linoleum. "Code in the lobby. I need a gurney." The shout came from a young resident, Dr. Patel, already moving before he'd finished the sentence. He hit his knees beside her, reaching for a pulse, and Diesel exploded. He didn't bite. He'd been trained too well for that, trained to control without committing, and his jaws snapped shut a finger's width from Patel's wrist with a crack like a rifle bolt and a snarl that rattled the vending machine glass. Patel scrambled backward onto his tailbone. Diesel mounted Lindsay's chest like a sentry over a fallen position, teeth bared at the whole room, the message unmistakable in any language. "Come closer and lose the hand." "Security now," the nurse screamed into her phone, and within seconds a guard, heavyset, name tag reading R. Dubois, came through at a run, taser already out, red dot dancing on Diesel's ribs. "Call him off," Dubois barked, hands shaking worse than his voice. "Call him off or I drop him right here." Lindsay, fading, fixed on that red laser dot the way a body fixes on a threat, even when the mind underneath it is shutting down. Something primal and combat-wired surged up through the fever, and she hauled herself onto her elbows, wrapped both arms around Diesel's neck, made herself the thing between the taser and the dog. "You touch him," she rasped, "and I will end every single one of you." Total standoff. Patients flattened against the far wall. Dubois sweating, taser locked on a moving target he was terrified to miss. Patel was already shouting for animal control with a tranquilizer kit, for police, for anyone. "We can't treat her like this. The dog has to be subdued," and Dubois' finger was tightening on the trigger when the trauma bay doors banged open. A nurse walked in, mid-30s, dark circles under sharp eyes, scrub top still damp at the collar from a shift that clearly hadn't let up. Her ID badge read R. Nakagawa, RN. She'd heard the barking and the screaming from 2 hallways over and come to see what kind of disaster she was walking into. "What in God's name is going on?" She started, then stopped dead. She wasn't looking at the dog first. She was looking at the woman underneath him, at the jagged scar tracking down the left side of her jaw from a piece of frag that had nearly taken her ear off in 2019, a scar that Reiko Nakagawa had seen described once. in a letter she still kept folded in her sock drawer, in her late husband's handwriting. "There's a captain on attachment with us, Ray. You'd like her?" Got cut up bad outside the market in March, but wouldn't leave until everyone was on the trucks. Then her eyes moved to the dog, the torn left ear, the grey muzzle going sim-silver too early for his age, and there faded into the pink skin of his good ear where the fur had thinned, a tattoo she'd traced with her own thumb 100 times on a video call from a forward operating base 3 years ago, back when the dog had a different name and her husband still had a future. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Bear." The dog's ears flicked. Nobody else in the room caught it, but Rico did, and her pulse went through the floor. She'd been told this dog had been medically retired after the IED that killed her husband, Master Corporal Tomas Nakagawa. 4 years ago, outside a compound nobody back home was ever given the full name of. She'd been told he'd thrown himself partially over Tomas trying to shield him, and that he'd been so traumatized by the blast he'd never work again, that he'd been quietly rehomed to a teammate who then vanished off every record she had access to. She'd spent 2 years trying to track that teammate down, just to see the dog one more time, before grief and exhaustion finally made her stop looking. "Holster it," she said to Dubois, voice gone flat and absolute. "Ray, are you out of your mind? That dog will take your arm off." I said, "Holster your weapon. That's not a request." Dubois lowered the taser an inch, no further, and Rico stepped past him, straight into the perimeter Diesel had drawn around his collapsed handler. He lunged instantly, stopped a hand's width from her knees, a roar building in his chest that made the overhead lights seem to flicker. Lindsay, barely conscious, managed one cracked syllable, "Bear no," and froze because she'd never once called him that. Rico didn't step back. She lowered herself to one knee, bringing her face level with 100 pounds of furious animal, close enough to feel his breath, and she reached 4 years back into a memory she'd buried, because it hurt too much to keep on the surface. Her husband's voice, low and warm, teaching the puppy a release word that meant nothing to anyone but the two of them, a word he'd told her, half joking, half serious, in case anything ever happened to him, and someone needed to bring his dog back from wherever his training might take him. She looked the dog dead in the eye and said it. Kuma, it wasn't loud. It wasn't desperate. It landed in that fluorescent-lit chaos like a stone dropped into still water, and the whole room seemed to lean toward the silence that followed. The snarl building in Diesel's throat caught, stuttered, died. His ears, pinned flat a half-second earlier, snapped up and forward. His eyes, dark, sharp, suddenly very far away, searched her face like he was looking for a ghost standing behind her. Some deep, conditioned circuit that had been waiting 4 years for exactly this sound finally fired, and the message it sent through his entire body was simple. "Stand down. The fight is over. You're safe." The fur along his spine smoothed flat. A sound came out of him that had nothing to do with the snarl from 30 seconds earlier. High, thin, almost a whimper, and he took one trembling step forward and pressed his nose into Reiko's open palm. He did not bite. He surrendered completely. Somewhere behind her, Dubois made a small strangled noise and finally put the taser away. Patel was still on the floor, staring like he'd watched something defy basic physics. But Reiko wasn't looking at either of them. She kept her eyes on the dog, running her fingers through fur scarred in places she remembered from old photographs, feeling his heart hammering under her hand. "Good boy," she said, and her voice cracked clean in half on the second word. "Stand down. You did good." Then the nurse came roaring back into her, faster than the grief had. "Move! Gurney now, she's crashing." Patel and an orderly were on their feet instantly, and within seconds Lindsay was on a stretcher being pushed through the double doors toward the trauma bay, ashen, soaked in cold sweat, blood pressure in the basement. Reiko held the leash tight in one fist as the gurney disappeared, and Diesel strained after it, every instinct screaming at him to follow his handler, until Reiko gave the lead a firm tug and said, simply, "No, she's in good hands. You stay with me." Miraculously, he did. He sat heavily on the cold tile, eyes fixed on the swinging doors, and waited. For 6 hours, the operating room fought to keep Lindsay Marchetti's body from shutting down completely, draining the abscessed pocket around the old shrapnel wound, flooding her system with antibiotics, working to undo what 3 years of denial and 4 days of pride had let fester. Reiko spent those hours in a corner of the staff lounge with 80 pounds of exhausted dog asleep across her lap, stroking the ruined fur around his torn ear, mind 1,000 kilometers away on a dusty road outside a compound she still couldn't picture without her chest going tight. Hospital administration had already called, twice demanding the dog be removed by animal control. Rico had told them, in language that surprised even her, that they could try. She remembered the letters Thomas used to send, long, rambling things about the half-trained puppy he'd been assigned, how stubborn he was, how he refused every command except the ones that came with real affection behind them, how Thomas had given him a private name nobody on the paperwork would ever see. "I named him after you, sort of," he'd written once. "He's got your stubborn streak, wouldn't budge for anyone but you, and now apparently not for anyone but me either. Guess we're both stuck with him." When the IED took Thomas, the official line was that the dog had sustained injuries trying to reach him and would never be fit for service again, that he'd been quietly discharged and adopted out to a surviving teammate who'd since gone off-grid. Nobody had ever told her the teammate's name. Nobody had told her the dog had been renamed to bury what happened in that compound. And now here he was, asleep in her lap in a hospital break room in Parry Sound, 4 years and one impossible coincidence later. When Lindsay finally surfaced, it felt like coming up through ice water into a flashbang. Her whole body was wrapped in something heavy and unfamiliar that turned out to be a hospital blanket, her thigh throbbing with a dull, manageable ache, instead of the white-hot fire of 2 nights before. Her hand went immediately for a weapon that wasn't there, scanning a ceiling that wasn't her cabin's, every trained instinct in her screaming compromised before her conscious mind even caught up. Then the panic narrowed to one single, specific terror. "Diesel," she rasped, throat sandpaper. "Where's Diesel?" The answer hit the mattress half a second later, 80 pounds of dog leaping up beside her, tongue across her cheek, an excited whine she hadn't heard out of him in years. She got both arms around his neck and held on, face buried in fur that still smelled faintly of cedar smokes from home, and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 years straight. "Good boy," she whispered into his shoulder, voice breaking apart. "We made it. We actually made it." A chair scraped quietly in the corner. Lindsay's head snapped up, every hardwired threat assessment back online in an instant, landing on a woman in dark blue scrubs sitting with a paper cup of bad coffee going cold in her hands, tired, steady, watching her with an expression Lindsay couldn't immediately place. "You're the nurse from the lobby," Lindsay said, voice still wrecked. "How did you get past him?" "He doesn't let anyone get that close. Not anyone." Reiko looked down at the dog, head resting comfortably on Lindsay's blanketed legs now, tail giving one slow thump against the mattress at the sound of her voice. "He's a fully trained military asset," she said quietly, the clinical language sitting strangely natural in her mouth. "Patrol, explosives detection, close quarters control. But he also has a release command. A failsafe built specifically to break a fixation like the one he was in tonight." Lindsay's eyes narrowed, the monitor at her bedside ticking up a few beats faster. "Only his handler would know a command like that," she said slowly. "And his handler's dead." "I know," Reiko said. Her hand went to the chain at her throat, and she drew out a dog tag gone dull with 4 years of handling, the chain worn soft at the clasp. She held it out into the light without saying anything else, because she didn't need to. Nakagawa, T. The embossing was still legible, just barely. The air went out of the room. Lindsay stared at that tag the way you stare at something that's just confirmed the worst thing you've spent years trying not to think about. This was Tomas's wife, The woman he used to talk about on long watches outside Kandahar, half a world and a lifetime away. The woman Lindsay had spent 4 years quietly, privately certain she had failed beyond any forgiveness. Reiko, she said, the name coming out cracked and unfamiliar in her mouth, like she'd been carrying it silently for years and only now had permission to say it out loud. I tried. God, I tried. The wall came down before I could get to him. I grabbed the dog. I couldn't. I couldn't get to Tomas in time. She braced for it, for the anger she'd built an entire isolated life around deserving. Instead, a warm hand settled over hers, and when she opened her eyes, Reiko was standing beside the bed, crying without trying to hide it, looking at her with nothing in her face but a grief that recognized its own reflection. I know you tried, Reiko said, voice thick, fingers tightening gently around Lindsay's scarred hand. He trusted you with his life out there. He trusted you with Bear. That's not nothing, Lindsay. That's everything. Diesel let out a low, contented huff and pressed his head down across both their joined hands, a warm, solid bridge between two kinds of grief that had been carrying each other's weight in silence for 4 years without either woman knowing the other existed. The cabin in the bush, the 3 years of motion sensors and silence, suddenly felt very far away and very unnecessary, like a fortress built around a war that had finally, quietly, ended. They weren't fighting it alone anymore. The standoff, in every sense that mattered, was finally completely over.